got some fans in the audience. I love it. Hello, everyone. My name is Teresa Lieb. I'm the VP of Nature and Europe at Greenbiz, and it's been my pleasure to help lead and grow this really exciting community of practitioners and investors and corporates, corporate sustainability professionals who are trying to incorporate nature and biodiversity into their sustainability strategies. And I'm very glad that Tom came before us because he actually set us up perfectly for this conversation, and he took away the job for me to explain why we need to worry about biodiversity and what the extinction crisis is, and why we should care about beavers. So thank you, Tom, for that great setup. And I'm joined by two excellent speakers today. Nela Duke Ekpenyong is joining us from Lagos in Nigeria today. Nela is a conservationist, a venture capitalist, and really trying to bridge the gap between the nature and climate communities in Nigeria and in many other countries in Africa. So very excited to have you here. Thank you for making the trip. And then Raviv Turner, who's joining from Boulder, Colorado, also a great nature place. Raviv is a founding member of the Nature Tech Collective, which is a really rapidly growing organization at the center of lots of entrepreneurs building nature tech startups and solutions and working to embed them across the corporate sustainability ecosystem. And as I learned yesterday, Raviv is also now managing partner at a brand new venture studio called NatureX, and has a lot of experience as an entrepreneur before going into the nature space. So thank you both for being here today.
Great to be here.
All right, so to kind of continue where Tom has ended his presentation, I think he was a little bit more pessimistic about the state of nature investment than I am, and than you both are, I think, as well. So, and I guess to maybe take a step back, I think nature and biodiversity for many of us working in the private sector is kind of a new thing, but it's not a new thing for a lot of other people around the world. There have been governments, development banks, lots of conservation organizations trying to do this work for a really long time and trying to finance nature-based solutions, finance conservation programs, finance coming up with markets for ecosystem services. So investing in nature is not new, but it's new for this community. And I think that is an exciting thing, because even though we're not the first ones working on this, I think the private sector can play a really important role in actually scaling those investments, speeding them up, and making sure that we don't just invest in carbon capture plants, but also in beavers. And so, Raviv, I want to start the conversation with you. Can you explain a little bit about why that is happening now? Like, what is different now from the past 30 years of more like philanthropic and public investment in nature? Why is the private sector getting engaged? And what's changing as a result?
Yes, I think what's changing is the elevated risk that we see from nature, and that's transition risk, so risk from regulation and litigation. I'm also part of the TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures on the data group. So we've been seeing this kind of building in the system. We have, I think, over 300 companies that already committed to TNFD this year. We have another hundreds of companies that committed to follow TNFD next year. We have SBTN, which is science-based targets for nature. We have CSRD in effect in Europe already. We have the UDR for deforestation. So there's elevated transition risk for sure. We're also seeing elevated physical risk, mostly to supply chain, specific industries, pharma, real estate, construction, food and ag, and other industries that's starting to see physical risks from nature. And that's water, soil, biodiversity, that translates into lots of value destruction to those companies between now and 2030. And then last one is systemic risk that spans across the entire system. One example of systemic risk that we've seen here in the US back in 2019 was PE&G that went bankrupt from fires in California and not working with nature and doing some of the vegetation management. And there's plenty, I think, of examples in the markets right now for building physical risks, and that's a ticking time bomb for portfolio managers and asset managers that need to go really deep into understanding nature and the risks that nature presents to their portfolios.
Mm. That's a great example of PG&E. Do you have another example from the supply chain perspective? I think that's where I'm seeing a lot of companies investing and getting involved. And how does that risk then translate into opportunity, both like for resilient supply chains, but also for financial opportunity?
Yes. So yeah, there are other examples of that physical risk, post-transition and physical risks. AAK that makes vegetable oil, and I think got sued for sourcing illegal palm oil from Indonesia. Mm-hmm. Or Bernard Matthews in the UK in poultry that had to cull hundreds of thousands of chickens from birds' food. So that risk is building, but also present opportunities. We're seeing companies doing insetting now for nature and really starting to invest in system restoration and restoring ecosystem alongside their supply chain. We're also seeing investors, mostly institutionals and also impact investors, family offices, entering the space and investing mostly in timber and in agriculture. Here in the US, we have some firms such as SLM Partners and Farmland LPs and others that actually now getting into the business of buying degraded land, putting operators, building topsoil, regenerating that land, and seeing double-digit returns from investing in regen agriculture.
Okay, so we're really seeing that mindset shift from nature as a resource that companies can use to nature as infrastructure, critical infrastructure for the future. Nela, that's what brings me to you. You've been, for many years, trying to conserve a really critical piece of nature ecosystems at the border between Nigeria and Cameroon, called the Obudu Conservation Area. And I think that kind of effort in conserving that land has also changed during that time, and becoming easier now as kind of like this global interest in nature is arriving on the ground, more or less. So can you talk a little bit about what you've been trying to do and how that dynamic is shifting at the moment?
Thank you. So I'm going to start by, and first of all, thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure. I'm going to start by, throwing a question to the audience. Indulge me, please. How many of us, just by show of hands, very quickly, how many of us know that gorillas are in Africa? I'm going to switch from beavers to gorillas for a second. Okay, yeah, okay, perfect, good. Now, how many of us have heard of the Cross River gorilla? Therein lies the problem. So thank you. So as Teresa shared, I am a venture capitalist by day, a conservationist by night, and the area that we're working to protect is actually a biodiversity hotspot, of which there are only 35 left in the world. I promise it won't be all doom and gloom. There are only 35 of them left in the world. And what makes them so unique is that if they are lost, they can't be regenerated. And so it's just gone. And in Africa, part of the investing that I'm doing is around climate adaptation. And we've seen that on the continent, Harvard released a paper that out of the 20 most affected countries of climate change, 17 of them are in Africa. But we are definitely not responsible for the climate crisis or a vast majority of those emissions, right? So that we're disproportionately affected. And what we've seen on ground when looking at, some of the challenges and perhaps the risks that accompany them are, twofold. One being financial, And dealing with nature recovery, a lot of the capital historically has come from the global north. And there's no issue with that, nor is there particularly an issue with the effectiveness of the mechanisms that are used in nature investing for offsetting, for carbon offsetting. Where the crisis really lies is actually in the human rights violations that can occur. And how that happens is not without the involvement of the local communities at large. And what we've seen is that if those communities aren't involved, so it's very much top-down when looking at conservation, especially in Africa. And so if those local communities aren't involved from the get-go, what happens is that, one, it's not sustainable and nothing actually takes place. And then two, you have this neo-colonialism that can happen around biodiversity credits and corporates, right? So we are working closely with a lot of organizations to combat that. We're also working very heavily with women in the community. I can't stress enough how important women are at the local level in Africa. Our populations are growing very rapidly. They're about, women in Nigeria at least have about 5 children per woman. I myself have 3, so I joke with my husband, 2 more and we're there. He doesn't find it funny. But it's really the stakeholder involvement is what we're working on, yeah.
And do you have any examples from your own work in the Buru region around, how are you trying to do that right, or better at least?
Yeah, so we work with NCF, and one of the projects that has been done is we have a nature reserve called the Becheve Nature Reserve, and so we have about 1/3 of Nigeria's forest, and it goes into Cameroon, and there we have we're using the biodiversity credits, but working with the local community. So the local community are used as stakeholders, and they guard they do the safeguarding. But more importantly, the profits, 60% of the profits go to the local community, which then gets filtered down to education, healthcare, and sustainable livelihoods. So there's a need for them to be recognized for their importance to the global economy.
And then how do you, see the dynamics shifting now that there's a lot of investors, startups really trying to get engaged in nature conservation? Do you see a lot of private capital coming into Nigeria, trying to support these sorts of projects, the work that you do as well? Or is it still too early?
I wouldn't say it's still too early. Yeah. We're just at the cusp. Right, and what is incredible about the work we're doing, so my firm, my family office, we're actually, I think someone mentioned this yesterday, that in emerging markets, the public and the private sectors, never the two shall meet, but it's slowly starting to change. And what we are doing with the Ugandan government, with the Ministry of Science and Innovation, is for the first time putting together a climate tech summit that which will result in policies being drafted to create a more enabling environment for climate innovation. And so the players that will be involved in that will be, academics from Harvard, Yale, MIT. We have DFIs coming in from Europe. We have, notable institutional organizations are also coming in. So you see that there is an actual charge on ground, and there's a need and there's a want for this evolution and change.
Okay, great. So you've outlined some of the kind of building blocks that we need to have in place for nature to become investable infrastructure, which is community engagement, working with local communities, working with indigenous leaders as well. I think that has been a big part of the conversation. Working with governments, trying to bridge the gap between governments and the private sector. Raviv, what would you add to that? I think you're very deep in the technology development piece. What are some exciting things that you're seeing from a technological point of view that really enables capital to flow from where it is to where it needs to go?
Yep, so we're seeing some of the members of the Nature Tech Collective, companies that develop pDNA solutions, bioacoustics, smart sticks in the ground that can measure soil, working now together with financial institutions, with banks, with insurance companies, to make sure that we can, I say we can treasure what we can measure, right? So establish a baseline, and working with those companies also to de-risk greenwashing, and making sure that they can do claimable impacts and work with those new technologies to really bring it back to their ESG reports and make sure that they have the data to back it up for their claims. So there's some really new and fascinating technologies that can make investing in nature more affordable. On the financing side, we have a 700 billion.
Can you just give a few examples of like the technologies that you're most excited about?
Yes. So eDNA, you can take a drop of water and really map species in an ecosystem and understand what's around you. It doesn't solve for abundance, but at least it can tell you, are you in a sensitive biodiversity hotspot? Mm-hmm. Or there are any endangered species in the area where you operate and your value chain exists. So you can take care of this. You can also make sourcing decisions and might decide to move your sourcing somewhere else where it's less sensitive for biodiversity. Bioacoustics can listen to birds and start mapping birds. Technologies that can follow migratory birds, for example, around wind turbines, and really give executives decision supports on where to source from and where to build infrastructure in a way that it's less harmful for nature and biodiversity. Technologies that can measure soil and do continuous measurement of soil. There's so much we don't understand yet about soil. And now there is the need to go and take a soil sample, send it to the lab. We're starting to see smart sticks in the grounds that can measure for 13 different soil metrics and measurement and tell you something about the soil, which then tells you something about the food and nutrient density. And of course, we are nature, so all those technologies are connected to our else. So yeah, pretty exciting and fascinating tech development.
Yeah, amazing. And I think that speaks to what I hear a lot of people being concerned about is, okay, well, biodiversity is very complex. It's much more, and it is true that it is much more complex than carbon. There's no one single metric that we can track. And then we're also not just worried about biodiversity, but also water and other kind of like nature-related outcomes. But I think just getting stuck on the fact that we can measure the outcomes is kind of not the right place to stop. And because of all of these new technologies that are being developed really quickly and really like tested with a lot of corporate partners as well. So I think there's really rapid progress in this space right now, and hopefully measurement won't be the big worry anymore when we have this conversation again next year, or maybe in 2 years. But since we are almost out of time, I think as kind of a closing question for both of you is, how profitable will investing in nature as infrastructure be? And how profitable should it be, and for whom? So thoughts on that, and how do we get it right?
So how do we get it right? I don't have the exact answer for that, but I will say that investing in nature, I think globally is about $113 billion a year, but it needs to go up significantly more, and that's specific to Africa. And one of the big takeaways I do want to leave everyone here with is not looking at it as a philanthropic endeavor, right? That Africa is not it's not a story that needs to be saved, but rather it's a business opportunity that needs to be seized. So I would frame it in that way. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Raviv.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is money to be made investing in nature. I also think we have to be realistic. This came up on the water panel yesterday, where investors are expecting 25% IRR from investing in water infrastructure. Okay, that doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. But we've seen double digits returns, and adjusting these risk-return profiles and thinking of nature as very precious real estate. At the end of the day, we have this thing called the biosphere, and it's 20 kilometers from the ocean bottoms to the mountaintops, and that's where life exists. So that's the most precious real estate that we have. And we are seeing investors investing in timber, in agriculture, in wetlands, in mangroves. So we're starting to see this happening with double-digit returns, and also thinking about return on impact, not just return on finance, and how can we quantify this? How can we quantify ecosystem services and invest in pollination, for example? And then do this in order to mitigate risk. I mean, if there's no biodiversity, there is no pollination. There is no pollination, there is no coffee, There's no coffee, there's no Starbucks. It's as simple as that.
All right, I think that is a great place to end. If you would like to learn more about this, Greenbiz has launched Bloom, our biodiversity event last year. This year we're taking it to Cali in Colombia, and we'll be hosting it alongside COP16. So if you're there and if you want to join us, please scan this QR code and you can request an invitation to dive deeply into this topic for 2 days. All right, so with that, I hope you'll join us in Cali, but for now, join me in thanking Raviv and Nela for being here today.
Thank you.